So my name is Dunstan Alison Hope, as Aaron pointed out. I'm a managing director at BSR, and for the past decade, I've led BSR's work with information and communications technology companies. Now, you don't need me to tell you that a lot has changed in information and communications technology over the last decade. Nobody was tweeting at my first BSR conference in 2004. But one of my challenges over the past decade has been to understand what really matters about the internet. Rather than getting swept up in all the hype, what really matters about how the internet is changing the society in which we live? How has the internet influenced democracy, civic engagement, and human rights? These are all very difficult questions. One of my go-to places for insights on these questions has been our next speaker, Ethan Zuckerman. Ethan is director of the MIT Center for Civic Media and author of Rewire: Digital Cosmopolitans in the Age of Connection, which challenges our preconceptions about the relationship between digital media and culture. Among other things, Ethan is co-founder of the blogging community Global Voices and originator of the cute cat theory of digital activism. The cute cat theory of digital activism suggests that activists will reach larger audiences and be less likely to be censored if they use mainstream consumer internet platforms. As you can see, the next 20 minutes is going to be both thought-provoking and entertaining. So let me welcome Ethan to the stage.
Thanks so much, Dunstan. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. It's great to be with people who are engaged in this challenging, frustrating, but ultimately rewarding job of trying to change the world. And I was really encouraged when looking at BSR, and if I could just get my slides up, please. A question that BSR was wrestling with 2 years ago on its 20th anniversary. On the one hand, it feels like everything in this field has changed. On the other hand, it feels like nothing has changed at all. And this really spoke to me because we're at a very interesting inflection point for people in my field. I work on this question of the internet and social change. How do we use these remarkable new communication systems to make change at scale out in the world? And this year is the 25th anniversary of the World Wide Web as we know it. This is actually what the World Wide Web looked like 25 years ago when Tim Berners-Lee put it forward. The truth is most of us never saw it in this form. We're really celebrating the 20-year anniversary of the commercial web, which really started once we had a web browser that people would actually want to use, had pictures, had text the way we expect to see it. But we're now at 20 years of sort of reflecting on what the internet has and hasn't brought. And for me, I've spent 20 years trying to use the internet to bring information and bring voice to more people around the world. I was lucky enough to have a hand in founding one of the first companies that let people build their own websites, tripod.com. From there, I made the logical move to West Africa to try to work with a firm called GeekCore, which brought tech people burnt out from North America and Europe into sub-Saharan Africa to try to get businesses off the ground in places like Ghana. I met some remarkable people, and we started thinking about how do we change how the world knows about itself? How do we change who gets to talk about what's happening in the developing world? And spent 10 years on a project called Global Voices. And now, more recently, I'm down at MIT's Media Lab, where I work with brilliant students and researchers trying to figure out how do we build tools and technologies that let people speak to their governments, speak to their communities, have a hand in their politics. In other words, it would be hard to find anyone more bought into this notion that we can do good things with the internet. And if I wanted to give you the easy talk this morning, if I wanted to give you the sort of feel-good inspiration talk associated with inspire and innovate, I would start by trying to point to the things that we've done really well over the last 20 years. We have a remarkable new model for getting people to work together on shared works of knowledge, coming through things like Wikipedia. We have a lot to be proud of in the ways that people have used social media to mobilize and take to the streets and to try to demand their rights in the face of dictatorial governments. And there's a lot that companies like Facebook and Twitter and others can claim that they were responsible for in those sorts of changes. We have miracles that are so ordinary to us we don't even think about them anymore. When we think about the fact that we can live and work anywhere in the world and be at home in our office or home with our families through things like video conferencing and Skype. This is a beautiful set of portraits, by the way, by a guy named John Klang, who did family portraits of families united by Skype. So you have some people in the room and some projected from a Skype call on the wall. And the internet's been an amazing space for people from marginalized communities. If you're gay and lesbian in a small town, if you're a person living with a disability, if you're looking for a community, the internet has been an amazing place to turn to. But I can't give you that happy, smiley talk today because we're having a really bad year online. And this is a really interesting year. We're trying to sort of celebrate this 20th anniversary, this 25th anniversary, and what we're wrestling with are really horrific issues. We're in the midst of a conversation of something called Gamergate. And this is a terrible example of people's ability to be cruel to one another online. We have this remarkable scholar, Annalise Sarkeesian, who's been talking about the need for a feminist response to video games and ways in which video games end up being exploitative. And the response that she's gotten from this is a wave of death threats that's been forcing her to cancel performances and go into hiding. And this is an example of the ways in which we still haven't figured out how to treat each other very well in some of these spaces. If anonymity has been the problem associated with Gamergate, the lack of anonymity has been the problem that many of us have been wrestling with in the wake of Ed Snowden's revelations and discovering that many of us in the United States, probably everyone in this room, by virtue of the international natures of our business, find ourselves at least partially under government scrutiny and surveillance. And so a network that we had really hoped was going to be an open space for politics, an open space for activism, has turned out to be a very heavily surveilled space. Many of us had hoped that the ability to raise our voice and to talk about democratic and civic issues would lead us to transform politics. Maybe we would get to a politics that was somehow more participatory and more inclusive. And I think very few of us sort of feel that that's where we've been going. We seem to be heading into a world in which we're yet more divided, yet more partisan. It's easier and easier to hear the voices that you want to hear and to ignore the rest of these voices. I wrote a book recently talking about one of my great disappointments in this space. I really bought into this idea that the internet was going to shrink the world. We were going to have a much more genuine, much more deep human connection to people in other parts of the world because we could see what their lives were like, we could have conversations, we could read their media, we could have interactions. And in fact, near as we can tell, what's actually happening is the internet has made it much, much easier for us to stay in touch with people we already know. And so while we have the choice of finding out great amounts of information from all over the world, we're selecting from a giant smorgasbord. And on that smorgasbord are a whole bunch of people we already know to be important, and it's very, very hard for us to open our minds and open our eyes to different people and different issues. If you want an example of this, just think about Ebola in West Africa. This is a crisis that is likely to affect the entire world. But most of us were not paying attention to it when it broke in Guinea in March. We only started paying attention to it when it literally came to the US shores. We had the information, we had the ability to pay attention, but these tools don't necessarily guarantee that our view of the world is going to get any wider. So it's been interesting to watch real pioneers in this space talk about, are we happy with what we want? The guy here with Web We Want on his forehead, that is Tim Berners-Lee. He's the guy who built that first web page 25 years ago. He's the guy who has really become sort of our patron saint for this technology and for this community. And what's very interesting is that 25 years into this, he's not taking a victory lap. He's actually running a set of events called Web We Want. And the reason it's called the web we want is that the web that we have is not the web that he wants. He was hoping for a web that was going to be much more global, much more inclusive, much more open. And I think for many of us who've been working in this space for 20 or more years, we're counterbalancing what we're excited about with this sense of frustration and this sense of why weren't we able to do what we really hoped for with these technologies. Now, my guess is that this situation is pretty familiar, not just to the geeks in the room, but to anyone who's been trying to work on a complex, multifaceted issue for 2 decades or more. It's not uncommon to get a point on a problem where you stand back and say, was this actually working? Are we getting where we're going? And so I and a lot of people in this space have been going through a conversation that pretty much has sort of 3 forks to it. And one fork basically says, hey, let's not worry about it. The night is young. We just started. The internet's just out of its teenage years. Give us time. People still seem to be excited about this. I'm sure we can innovate our way out of this. And if you think about it, this is really the popular narrative. When I'm dealing with students in their 20s, they all still dream of being Mark Zuckerberg. They're convinced that if we keep going down this path in this fashion, it's going to keep getting better. And we're simply very, very early on in this. And what I'm saying is I'm having a crisis of faith. I actually don't think if we just keep building the net the way we do and not thinking about these larger issues of how we treat each other, what we pay attention to, how we protect privacy, how we protect civil rights online, that we're going to end up in a very good place. There's a very vocal and visible crowd putting forward a pretty straightforward thesis, which is this was not the way to look for social change. You guys were crazy. If you wanted real change, you needed to elect people. You never should have trusted this corporate space with big companies sort of running the internet. Why did you think technology was our salvation anyway? Why should anyone listen to you guys at all? You've been doing this for 20 years, and look at where we've ended up. You guys are idiots. And while it's easy to sort of lambaste those guys, and it's fun to argue with them, in some cases they have points. In some cases, we really do have to wrestle with the disappointments of what we got and what we haven't got in this space. And so I find myself at a space where I think we actually need to look at what we hoped to do 20 years ago. Those people who, like me, came on the internet not just because it was fun and cool and sexy, but because we saw a way that we could use these tools to change the world. And I think we have to reaffirm those values and rethink what we've built and possibly think about where we would go to rebuild. Now, I have to say that this has been a very personal search for me because I've been involved with some of the great problems on the internet. I was involved with building one of the first big social media companies. You may have noticed that those social media companies have gotten pretty darn big these days. And one of the ways that they've gotten big is they've essentially said, we're going to turn our customer acquisition costs down to 0. We're going to make it completely free to join Facebook, to join Twitter. And unsurprisingly, we've seen hundreds of millions of people show up. And when you start a company based around this idea that you're not going to make the revenue first, you have a limited number of models that you can work from. And the model that we've really ended up working from is advertising. And advertising seemed like it was going to be a fine model online because if you think about it, advertising online should work so much better than it does in the real world. You can't click on a billboard and find out more about a product. You can't click on a newspaper ad and do a transaction. You can do that online. So obviously, online ads should be worth a lot more. Turns out they're worth a ton less, anywhere from 10 to 100 times less. People call this the print dimes digital pennies problem. We're ending up with about a 10-to-1 ratio. And so what ends up happening is we're looking for ways to make these ads more successful. And the way that we've learned to do this is by getting more and more information on whoever's using these tools. So we want to know who you are, and we want to know what you like. And when you're not hanging out on our website, we want to know what other websites you're hanging out on so we can end up with a really detailed profile of who we are. And in the process, we have trained people over the last 20 years into using a system that, first of all, doesn't work very well. No one really likes online advertising except for the people making an enormous amount of money off of it from being ad brokers. Users don't like it, advertisers don't like it, and we may be training people to live in a society where they're perpetually under surveillance. So the trick with systems like this is they're really hard to fix. As long as the building is still standing, it's quite hard to convince everybody that it's time to get out of it. This is a system that works well enough. It works well enough that we're able to launch new businesses, we're able to get new things off the ground, but it doesn't work as well as it should, and it may, over time, be really damaging us. It may be, over time, getting us to the point where we're so used to the surveillance that we're under that we're willing to accept it in other aspects of our life. We're willing to accept it from governments as well as for corporations. But I gotta admit to you, the reason this is personal is that I've been deeply involved with this problem. You see, about 18 years ago, my boss came to me and said, we've got a problem. We're letting people put up these web pages. We've got to figure out how to put an ad on them. But we can't put the ad directly on the web page. Ford doesn't want to be on a page for someone's classic Chevy page. What are we going to do? And I said, no, 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 this is simple. We'll work it out. We'll just put an ad up. We'll just put it in a different window. You know, we'll just put up a window, and then another window will pop up, and we'll put an ad in it. It's going to be a great solution. You're going to love it. Turns out people didn't love it.
And guess what? The man who created the first internet pop-up ad says that he is sorry. He gave an interview and said he's sorry, yeah. The man also says a 15-minute call to Geico could save you 15%.
So that was a bit of a weird experience. I came out this summer as one of the creators of the pop-up ad, and I did it not because I have a thing for self-flagellation. I did it because I wanted to start thinking about how did we end up here? How did we end up on an internet where we're watched at all times by people who want to sell us better and better ads, and we're under constant surveillance? And I've learned a couple of things from this process. The first is that when we look at big problems in the world, we tend to assume that there's some bad guy out there trying to crush the world as we know it. Whether we think it's Zuckerberg or someone else, you know, sitting there and essentially saying, we're going to track everything out there, don't mistake incompetence for evil. I really did have no sinister plan when we tried to figure out how to put an ad on a page. I just came up with a really lame solution that happened, unfortunately, to be good enough that it persists to this day. And this is where good enough is a really big problem. Many of us work in industries where the solution that we have to a major problem is good enough that it persists. It lasts for a very, very long time, even if at the end of the day, no one really loves it and no one really wants to support it. And we know that over time, what it's doing to us is bad. It's having bad effects on us. But the big thing that I want to say is that these systems can be changed. 20 years into something, 20 years into an ad-supported internet, we tend to believe that Tim Berners-Lee came down on high with tablets saying, the web shall be free, and we shall support it with banner ads, and we shall track you in the process. And the answer is that didn't happen. This is just decisions that a bunch of mooks like me have been making over 20 years. And if we don't like where we ended up on this, it's possible that we can change it. And what's really exciting is that 20 years in, we're starting to see these amazing coalitions of people trying to change the rules. We've seen folks like Ed Snowden put out these whistleblower revelations supported by amazing papers like The Guardian and The Washington Post. And he's been able to do it with the support of organizations like the EFF, which has been trying to help individuals protect their online privacy. We're seeing little firms like Mailpile sort of spring up to say, what if all your email was encrypted? Always. It would be a whole lot harder for people to look inside the envelope there. And weirdly enough, you have really big companies like Google saying, you know, those guys are onto something, and we might actually try to do that at scale. You have folks like my friend Rebecca McKinnon coming along and essentially saying, if big companies are going to do this, we're going to monitor them and make sure that they're actually doing this right and make sure that they're complying. We have amazing folks like Darren Walker, who's going to talk to you tomorrow from the Ford Foundation, who thinks that philanthropy needs to be in the lead on questions like this, of trying to build out the sort of internet that we all deserve, one where not only are we consumers, but we're actually citizens. And so I tend to think of this as starting something like a rebel alliance. But the truth is, the rebel alliance implies that we've got the Darth Vader, that we've got the big bad guy. And the truth is, I actually haven't been able to come up with anything better than this notion of the web we want. We want a web that is not only a place where we can be commercially successful, but we can be successful as citizens, we can be successful as individuals, we can develop our voice, we can hear the voices of others. But what's interesting is when you use these ideas, when you sort of say, how do we get what do we want? The question is not just the web we want, the question becomes the world we want. So if you think the internet's messed up, and I do, I invite you to think about some other human institutions that might also be having a need for some reflection at this particular moment in time. We just had an election. We at least have some interesting change going on. It's unclear whether we're going to be able to break the record of the 2 least productive Congresses in history. It seems that still having a divided government, there are not a lot of bets for this. But this is another system like internet advertising, where if you look at it, you can see how what seemed like good solutions have ended up in a really terrible place. Representative democracy, that seems like a real nice idea, particularly when the dominant tech is feudalism, and where it's really, really hard to have everyone in a vast colonial nation get together in a room and argue. Freedom of speech, yeah, totally, seems necessary to be able to get there. The ability to support political campaigns, yeah, probably we're going to need something along those lines. You start following these ideas together, and you very quickly find yourself in a place where new incoming congressmen are told to spend between 5 and 6 hours a day raising money, and to use the rest of their free time to try to have interactions with constituents or, maybe pass laws. And you find yourself looking at this and sort of saying, I'm not sure that we can just tinker with this around the edges. I think we might need some really big radical change if we want to get towards the world we want. And fortunately, there's rebel alliances around here as well. We have guys like Larry Lessig, a guy who came from my world, a guy who was one of the most important thinkers about tech and social change, jump in and essentially say, look, I think we've got to start this almost from scratch. I think we've got to get money out of politics. I think we give every voter $50 and we try to figure out how to pull it together and run an election. Is it going to work? I have no idea. But it's significantly more radical than almost anything else that we're hearing out there. I'm finding a lot of inspiration in other countries. I'm spending a lot of time these days in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And I'm doing it because the mayor, Fernando Haddad, did something really interesting when he got elected. He said, I want you to hold me responsible to this well-defined set of campaign promises. Here's 100 of them. They've got numbers attached to them. If I don't build you 400 kilometers of bike lanes, if I don't put up 17,000 streetlights, don't vote for me next time round. And he did it in partnership with a guy who runs an organization of community organizations throughout Sao Paulo, so people in every single neighborhood who can hold him responsible for this. And he came to us at the Media Lab to say, can we try to figure out how to build the tools to let millions of Brazilians go out in the street and ask the question, is the government doing what they said they did? And so now we're building a system called Promise Tracker that allows people to pick an issue they want to monitor, put an app on their phones and share it with their friends, and go build a map of how the government is doing at actually doing their job so you can hold them responsible. And we thought we'd start small. We thought we'd work in the largest city in the Western Hemisphere, figuring that if we could do it there, we might be able to scale it up to a couple of other cities as well. We're getting lots of great ideas from around the world. Also coming out of Brazil is this remarkable piece of legislation, the Marco Civil da Internet. This was a bill, probably the most ambitious bill about regulating the internet. And it was written with government, with industry, and with more than 2,000 citizens contributing directly towards this. And whether this is the right bill and whether this gets picked up around the world, we now have this model that demonstrates that you really could build legislation and bring it out into the world in a different way. I'm not going to guarantee that any of these ideas is going to change politics as we know it. I'll go even further. I'm going to guarantee you that none of these is the one solution. But increasingly, I think the solution is this. We have to start by looking at things in our lives that we accept as good enough and realize that if we want to have real meaningful change, if we really want to get towards the web we want, if we really want to get towards the world we want, we have to accept that some of these things that we take for granted, some of these giant assumptions we make about what's possible or not, we've got to throw them out. We've got to get beyond good enough because it just isn't good enough. Thanks for your time.